the Glasgow COP26 meeting with about 200 countries internationally will be meeting to deal with the current crisis, climate crisis. And it's going to be very important. And so who knows, maybe the Friday before that or something, we might have a special gathering down there on the water in Wisconsin. There's going to be special gatherings around the country to promote this and to support the Glasgow talks. So you need to talk about this with people. And tonight we want to deal with how do we talk about this to kids. Many of us are grandparents or aunts or uncles or teachers, parents. And how is the best way to approach this issue? I'm sure we've all at times been kind of stymied when an 8-year-old kid all of a sudden is asking you some questions, or how much do they need to know? How do we explain this and make people aware without totally freaking them out and without them having any hope for the future? So I thought, well, there is a psychologist here in town who writes wonderful columns for the Shepherd Express, and he's been a columnist here locally for many years. I've always enjoyed his work, and I'd heard him speak before on nuclear issues. So I contacted Philip Chard, and he said that, yeah, this is something that's come up with some of the other talks he's given, and then is this an issue and a concern of his? How do we communicate in a positive, in a way that's going to tell the truth and still leave some hope for these kids' futures? So, Philip, you have been a counselor and a psychologist, an author of several books, and definitely a regular columnist. And you're a trainer for people. And so could you pursue this issue for us, please? And let us pick your brain after you talk about the best way to go about all this. Philip?
Thank you. Thank you for having me this evening. I appreciate your time, and I also appreciate your efforts on behalf of our planet. As a kind of a prelude to the remarks I'm going to be sharing with you, and I'm going to show a little PowerPoint, though I promise not to give you death by PowerPoint, which is common on Zoom meetings. But I wanted to set the context for you a little bit. This is an informal kind of survey, if you will, but I've spoken with many of my colleagues who are counselors, school counselors, psychotherapists in practice, and so on. And almost every one of them reports to me that they're seeing an increasing number of people who are coming in not only with a personal issue that affects them directly in terms of their own lives or their families, but with a underlying angst, if you will, about what's happening to the planet and the climate crisis behind all that. And so this is a pervasive and increasingly growing kind of sense of what we call existential angst, a feeling of a lack of safety, a feeling that the foundations upon which we have built our civilization, our society, are under great threat. And so many, many people, including children and teenagers and young adults, are reacting to what they are perceiving as what we all know to be an existential threat. And so the question becomes, particularly with young people, our children, our grandchildren, as you said, nieces, nephews, and so on, how do we broach this topic, which is a very disturbing one to many of us, with young people who have a lot less life experience in which to put this critical issue into context. As we get older and we've accumulated more of these experiences in life, and we built hopefully some greater resiliency to take on challenges that we face, we understand, even with that, if you will, wisdom that we gain through life experience, this can be a daunting thing to to get squared away with in our own minds and our own hearts. So when you think about young people, it's even much more so the case for them. So I'm going to be going through what we know from some work that's being done now in a variety of school systems. So here's the primary challenges that we're facing. I mentioned the fact that this is really considered an existential threat, and it is. So there's no real benefit in kind of sugarcoating this thing when we talk to young people. They deserve the facts, but how we present those facts can have a direct impact on how they react to it. We are, as I noted earlier, seeing a lot of what we're now calling eco-anxiety. And it's a kind of fear because it's existential, this threat. And we're seeing sometimes when people kind of get overwhelmed with information that's negative, there's a lot of it out there about the climate crisis, it's very easy for them to get into that sort of freeze place, if you will, where they feel like, basically, what's the point? What's the use? And that can lead to something we call a hopeless, helpless feeling, an attitude of, gee, what I'm going to do is so small, it just doesn't matter. Why even try? And that kind of an attitude, that helpless, hopeless attitude, is the thing that we want to push back against when we're talking with and hopefully educating young people about what we're up against. And we also know that there's a particular kind of mindset that seems to be most helpful for people in addressing this existential angst that comes from the climate crisis. We call that mindset realistic optimism. And it's, as the term implies, there's a heavy dose of realism here, the facts, but there's also this tinge of optimism that doesn't ignore the facts, but actually incorporates where we want to end up in these conversations with young people. We're hoping they will end up in this place where they have a mindset that's realistic, but also hopeful and optimistic at the same time. Now, I'm going to give you some unsettling statistics. That's always how we start these kind of talks. You want to, get everybody a bit frightened by statistics. What was it Mark Twain called them? Statistics and other damn lies, I think was what his term was. But at any rate, there was a major survey done around the climate crisis and incorporated almost 10,000 children and adolescents spread across 10 different nations, all of which were considered primarily developed nations. A term that could be called into question based on what we're going through these days. But at any rate, one of the questions that they asked them was, do you feel that the government in your nation is failing to address the climate crisis? And of these young people, 63% said they did. They felt that the governments were failing to act and to act in a way that would help to offset the impacts of the crisis. They also asked them if they find what they called their climate future frightening, basically, about what's coming and what's already here. They even went a little bit further with that question and they asked, do you feel that humanity is doomed? They actually used that term in the survey. Are we doomed by the climate crisis? 56% of them agreed with that statement. So over half of them have a very dour, downcast, pessimistic view of what we're up against and how to address it. And then they also asked this question, you've probably seen this if you've been following some of the media, where they asked children, are you hesitant to have children of your own when you grow up due to the climate crisis? 40% of them said yes, that they were hesitant about bringing another life into the world given what we're up against. So as you can see, those are some pretty unsettling views and some unsettling attitudes. And of course, these are the young people who are going to be dealing even more than we are with what's ahead. They also, in this same survey, looked at the emotional responses that these young people were having to the climate situation. And they categorized that into 8 different feeling states. And I'll go through these real quickly. The first 2 that hit the top of the list at 68% of the people, young people reported they were feeling these ways in relation to the climate crisis. Sad, 68%, afraid, 68%. And again, you kind of got that helpless, hopeless built into that. I'm sad about this. I feel dejected, but I'm also frightened by it at the same time. The next one on that list was anxiety at 63%, and then anger at 59%. And I actually saw the anger as being somewhat positive in the sense that you can channel that into action sometimes. And so that was they looked at it as a negative. I looked at it as a potential positive. The one that was more negative was powerless. They felt powerless. 57% of them, the majority, felt that their actions would really not be effective in addressing what's going on. And here's an interesting one. 51% of them reported feeling guilty, meaning they looked at their own actions or the actions of their families and communities and felt bad about the fact that they weren't doing more to address the climate change. And that can also be a positive. Sometimes we do things positive out of a sense of guilt, because guilt also carries a sense of responsibility. On the brighter side, 32% reported they were optimistic. Now that's a minority, obviously, but it's a start. And so there were some who are saying, yeah, there's hope, but most were not. And that's why these conversations with young people are so important. We can't just walk around assuming that they're going to get it when it comes to the climate issue and step up and do what they can. We have to have this kind of dialogue if we're really going to advance the efforts of the younger generations in addressing this problem. So I kind of wanted to divide up how we talk to these, how to talk to young people, or I should say talk with young people, because that's more important than talking at them. But let's start out with the youngest of the bunch. So toddlers and young kids, like say up to age 5. Let's go with that. First of all, it kind of has to be climate 101. I mean, you need to familiarize little kids with the cycles of the seasons and how climate and weather are different. You kind of have to give them the basics of what we're talking about. Don't assume that they understand when we say the word climate, that they know what we're talking about. And to giving them examples is certainly the best way to do that. I've encouraged parents who've come to me with this concern to take their little kids out on nature walks and hikes. And also while they're there, to point out to them how the things around them, the birds, the trees, the plants, the animals, are reacting to these climate cycles, the seasons and the natural cycles of climate, so that they get an understanding of how climate and life forms and life processes are intimately intertwined. That becomes a really important thing for them. And kids this age, they don't understand concepts very well. They're not pre-linguistic, but they're close. And as a result of that, they learn more by experiences. Actually, we all learn more by experiences, but they do in particular. So if you give them these actual experiences in nature where you can say, well, you see how the trees are turning color? That's because we're entering a different season. How does that happen? Well, it happens because the earth tilts on its axis, so on and so forth. Educate them about what climate really is all about and how it's created, so they have a basic understanding to work from. The other thing we find is really helpful with these younger kids is that if you can engage them in gardening, even indoor gardening. Outdoors really the best, but certainly during the winter indoor takes over for many of us. But that's a process where they can see how plants need certain kinds of things to grow and prosper, like clean soil and the food and nutrients in that rich soil, like the watering, the fresh water and clean air to grow, and relate that to the same thing is true for humans and other animals. We need the same kinds of beneficial environmental capacities in order for us to grow and prosper. And so that helps them to connect. It's also important at a subliminal level, because when we garden, we are actually collaborating, if you will, with the life force to grow something new, to bring and create something new in the world. And when kids learn that mysterious and wonderful thing can happen and that they can be a part of it, it helps to give them a sense of connection with nature, which is what they're going to need in order to address the climate crisis going forward. And it's also helpful to make it local. Tell them that the climate is changing once they understand what climate is, and show them examples of how that change is influencing their own community. Maybe it's hotter summers, shorter winters, altered precipitation patterns, floods, more powerful storms. You can tell them that some of these effects that they're witnessing and experiencing themselves are the result of these shifts in climate caused by humans. And it's important for them to realize that. Then let's talk about what preteen children, let's say like 5 up to 12, that grouping. How do you talk to them that's a little different than even the younger kids? Well, first of all, you ask. You ask them, what do you know about climate change? What questions do you have about it? What concerns do you have? Like, kind of pick their brain a little bit because they're old enough to begin forming these opinions and viewpoints. And rather than just blasting in there and assuming they don't know anything or they don't have questions, we should start by opening up the dialogue that way. You know, have you thought about climate change? What do you know about it? What are your questions? Do you have concerns about it? And so on. Certainly you want to answer those for them and offer them resources for additional learning as well, if they want to know more. And also, if they have concerns or worries, you want to validate those. You don't want to, we'll figure it out. You know, you don't want to give them that kind of stuff. You want to validate those concerns. You have a right to be concerned or even worried about what's going on. And you know, I am too. So you can validate that by acknowledging your own concerns. Be real. Offer them facts about what's happening with the climate, the scientific facts, including the risks it poses to our collective well-being. And you don't have to sugarcoat the facts, but it also isn't helpful to embellish them with a lot of emotionality or hyperbole. You know, just kind of like they said, right? Just the facts. And so that's how you want to go at it. But also at the same time, you want to interject, along with the facts, hope. Tell them that action is key to turning things around and righting our ship of the planet, if you will. And also remind them that good people and good organizations, such as your own, are engaged with helping to meet these challenges so that they don't get the impression that it's just threat, risk, bad, damage, and nothing's being done about it. Nobody cares about you. They need to know that people care, and they need to know that people are acting on those concerns. And then again, bring it home. Point out what they and your family, perhaps, and your community are doing to try to make a difference, and invite them to be part of that process if they are so inclined. So it's really important with this age group, because they're a little more sophisticated than younger ones, that you zero in more on giving facts and addressing and validating concerns. So let's talk about teenagers. Very important that we start out a conversation with teenagers about this by, again, you start by asking questions. You don't start by lecturing like I'm doing right now. And you validate again, let them talk about any concerns they may have and empathize with their feelings about that, just like you would with the younger kids. Teenagers won't always let you know that they appreciate your empathy, but usually they do. And so don't hesitate to provide it. And you also, with teens, need to expand the scope of the conversation. They're more aware of the larger context of climate change than younger children are. They absorb more media, more news, a lot of it on social media, unfortunately, but they absorb this information and it's more global to them. They understand that these are planet-wide impacts, not just local ones. And so they're able to absorb a bit more in terms of facts and information about the global impacts of the crisis. And it's particularly important with young people that we offer them a call to action. That if they express to us that they have these concerns, that we very much encourage them and even help them if we can to get involved with groups and efforts in their community. And many schools, many high schools in particular, have clubs or organizations or programs that are focusing on climate change. So you could ask them to explore what's available in their own educational milieu that they might be able to engage with. And then last but not least in this group, with teenagers in particular, though certainly with younger kids as well, role modeling is critical. Okay, so if we are talking to them about it's how important it is for them to be engaged and doing the right things on behalf of the climate, then we also have to point out what we're doing in that regard. So it's not just, well, you should handle this. I'm older, I'm going to leave it to you young people. That kind of thing is not helpful. And they need to know we're all in this together across all generations. There's a few considerations, regardless of what age child you're talking to, that I think are really important to focus on here a little bit. And one, of course, is age. Talk at their level. With younger kids, examples or even little anecdotes or stories, and there are books out about the climate crisis that sometimes parents can read to their younger kids that are helpful in this regard. But they learn better from examples and stories than they do from abstract concepts or data points. That's also true of kids right up through almost 13 years. But it's particularly true for toddlers and preschool kids, kindergarten, and so on. So talk at their level. If they look like they're zoning out and kind of getting that, what I call the frogs watching lightning look, then you know that you've lost them, and go back and try to bring them back on board with some more language that's down to earth. It's also very important to be mindful of the temperament of the child if you know them well. Their degree of emotional sensitivity is going to be a factor here, and their degree of emotional maturity is going to be a factor here. So if you have a kid who's kind of an old soul and they, kind of get it right off the bat, well, that's great. You can generally share more information without spooking them. But if you have a young person that's really highly emotionally sensitive, and I'll get into that in a moment, and maybe seems like they're not quite as sophisticated in their knowledge, it's easier to freak them out. And so you have to be a little more judicious with sensitive children than the ones who seem like, they can handle stuff a little more easily. So you want to assess always, as I said right at the beginning, ask them what they know, ask them how concerned they are. And younger kids may not be ready to fully engage with the topic. So don't assume that. It's sometimes just enough to introduce the topic, make them aware that you know that it's going on, and that they know it, and that if they ever do want to talk to you about it, you're available to them. So sometimes, if it seems like the kid really doesn't want to go there, it's okay to back off and just let them know that if and when they want to talk about it, you're available to do so. That way they feel a little more control over the dialogue, and that will make them more likely to engage you when they are ready to talk. Some of them won't be. I've talked to some parents who have kids who are really frightened about this stuff because they've been absorbing a lot of the negativity from the media around it. I've had some parents talk to me about kids who are having nightmares that seem to be related to this. Others who speak about anxiety they're experiencing about it. What about their future? So on and so forth. And so don't assume that they can handle it. If you see them kind of getting, if you get that feel from them that this is a little bit too much for them, that's the sign to back off and just make them aware. I'm here if you want to talk. For those who are interested in talking, it's more important that you ask questions than that you give information. So let's say every time you give them a piece of information, let's say you're talking to them about sea level rise as a result of warming of the planet. After you've introduced that one piece of information, that's a good place to stop and then ask questions. Are you aware of that? What are your thoughts about it? What have you learned about it? How do you feel when you hear about this? Then you can go on to another data point and ask them questions about that. When we ask young people questions, a couple of really important things happen. Number one, they feel respected. They don't feel like we're just trying to jam information down their throat. We're interested in their opinions. We're interested in their feelings about things. They're much more likely then to be attentive and to engage with us when they realize that we respect and are interested in what they think as well. And we're not just here to lay our stuff on them. And the other thing that's important to do in asking questions is to be if they seem hesitant, they don't really want to talk, they don't want to answer a lot of questions, then it's okay to move more into an information mode. But most kids like to be asked questions because they feel like, oh, this adult's interested in what I think. And that can be a rare experience for some kids. So solicit their ideas also on what they could do themselves. That's where you kind of want this conversation to end up, is what do you think you might be willing or interested in doing that could have an impact, positive impact on this challenge that we're up against? Something they could do locally or at school or with their friends or their family. They already may be involved with something. They already may have ideas about it. So solicit that from them. And then finally, the last consideration is, in other words, spare the pie in the sky optimism. Okay, don't worry about a thing. We're going to figure this out. Everything will be okay. You don't believe that, and neither do they. And so when people get a little bit too, sugarcoating, silver lining this stuff, it becomes unbelievable. And so you need to focus on actions, okay? That's what makes people hopeful, not giving them a pep talk, not trying to assuage their fears by just glossing over them with, positivity. You want to call them to action because that's where their fear is going to be abated. We know from studies about people who are fearful, regardless of what it is, that if they act to do something to address that fear, they begin to feel empowerment in themselves. And then they set the stage for reducing their fear and increasing their sense of agency, of getting things done. Okay, so how do you know if a young person is really in a bad place with the climate crisis, meaning it is having a significant negative impact on them, and therefore that should be part of the focus of these conversations? First of all, if it's obvious, if they just come right out and express feelings of pessimism or hopelessness or what's the use even trying, then you know that this is a very important conversation to have. It's also important to look for something in this conversation coming from them that we call a negative cognitive bias. And a negative cognitive bias is just a fancy way of saying you see all the bad and you ignore all the good. Okay. I love these terms that my profession comes up with, like negative cognitive bias. It's representative of the fact I often say that people in my profession tell you things you already know in words you can't understand. And this is probably an example of that, but what it really is, it's a persistent worry, okay, in which we're always looking for what's wrong and what's dangerous and screening out anything that's positive or hopeful. And once a person develops this negative cognitive bias, which they usually do when they're overwhelmed with negativity inputs, think of media, once they adopt that, they get it very readily will go into the what's the use and give up, helpless, hopeless. The other thing to be aware of in young people is this negative media saturation. If you have a young person who's compulsively viewing media that emphasizes the damage and the risks wrought by the climate crisis and not acting on it or being involved with groups like your own or other groups that are taking action on the crisis, then that will lead to that negative cognitive bias. Unfortunately, a lot of young people get their information about this through social media. And we know that social media can be a very distorted and unreliable source of this kind of information. So one thing I've encouraged parents to do is to find and give to their children or grandchildren that are reliable and that aren't just trying to amp up their ratings. And that's really an important thing for them to do, is get balanced information. One other kind of warning sign or concern to be aware of is, you may have heard of this concept before. It's called highly sensitive persons, HSP for short. Somebody who is a highly sensitive person, and that comprises about roughly 15 to 20% of the general population, has a very intense emotional sensitivity. They really absorb emotionality and they feel it deeply within themselves. They often are very empathic. We call them very sensitive. If anybody ever said to you, oh, you're too sensitive, you should grow a thicker skin, you may be an HSP. People who are HSP and young children and teens, they can be HSP just like adults can be. They're more at risk of succumbing to the negativity they're absorbing in the media about the climate crisis than people who are not as sensitized. But they're also more likely to act and to do something about it. So if you have a child that you know, and parents or friends or whatever always say, well, so they're so sensitive, there's a possibility that they are HSP. Those kids in particular really need a lot of support, emotional support, to deal with their fears and concerns about the climate crisis. Okay, I'm almost done running my mouth here. I mentioned this before. It's really important when we have these conversations that we balance optimism with realism, that those two are joined at the hip in these conversations. It's not all negative, it's not all positive. Spare the spin, provide them with information, good factual information, minus the emotionality, minus a lot of the editorializing that we all like to do. Reassure them that there is a path forward. There are actions that we can take that will have an impact on this crisis going forward. In other words, you're not helpless. And focus more, I guess you should speak more with them about effort rather than outcomes. Okay, so the focus should be more on what we can do rather than, well, what's going to be the outcome of these efforts. The reason I say that is when people focus too much on outcomes, are we going to be able to stop the rise in global temperature, for example, by this year, such and such a year? When we focus too strongly on outcomes with young people, it's easy for them to get discouraged because these things can seem so out of reach, so far away, so unattainable. So the focus in the discussion needs to be more about effort. What are you going to do? What are we going to do together? How can we make a positive difference in this crisis? If we stay focused more on that, as opposed to, well, if we do this, then by this year, we're going to achieve this goal or whatever, because we don't know that. Okay, we can't promise these things, and we don't want to set up these false hopes. If they stay focused on effort over outcome, they're more likely to stay engaged with the work we need done to address this crisis. And the last thing, and again, save the most important for last, it's important that we also share with young people the hopeful signs that are out there, that do give them that sense of, hey, maybe we can do this. Maybe we can pull this off. Maybe we can turn the ship around. I've talked with parents about sharing, in particular, short videos with kids because they're very visual. That's how they tend to learn. They're not as verbal in that way as we were in our educations. They learn a lot from video. And there's some great videos out there that highlight not only the climate impacts, but also what to do about them. I'll just give you a quick example of that. I'll say that again, the intended, not unintended, not Al Gore's thing, the intended consequences of helping nature thrive, which is a wonderful short TED Talk that it's accessible to most kids, not the youngest, but certainly to kids that are in middle school and high school, that talks about how we can use science to help us with the extinction that's going on among species, how we can use that to combat that extinction. It's a very hopeful video. It's very scientifically based. Those are the kind of things that kids are going to listen to probably more than us, and that will give them messages that will instill that sense of hope at the same time with a call to action. So going on TED and YouTube and other media platforms and searching for positive but realistic messages that young people can absorb is another way to get to them. And there are some young people, particularly teenagers, that when an adult starts talking to them, it's like game over. Okay, I mean, they just kind of screen you right out. And sometimes they'll watch a video rather than listen to you. And that may not be what you want, but that in itself can open up the dialogue. Hey, I want to send you this video. After you're done watching it, if you want to chew the fat on it, let me know. We'll talk it over. That's a good way to get that kind of dialogue going because it gives them something to work with right off the top. Now, hope is what we're trying to instill in them, realistic hope. That's what we're after here. And hope comes from action and engagement. So whenever you see things going on in the community, locally, right around them, in their schools, wherever, that are hopeful in terms of climate action, sharing that with young people will continue to keep this front and center in their mind and also give them the belief, which they need, that we can make a difference. Okay, that's my wrap and I'm sticking to it.
And we're open for questions in the stack or comments. I see Jan. Go ahead, Jan.
Yes, really, I have a comment more than a question. I like the idea of laying the foundation for kids to be nature lovers, as you might refer to it as, by exposing them to the natural world and getting them to have this love and respect for it, and therefore they'll want to take care of it. And I think that's what we need to emphasize and also show examples for example, with the trees, planting a tree and telling them how important the trees are for cooling our world. And I think if we, do this, that maybe some of this fear and some of the pessimism will be not as great. Do you agree with that?
I do, and having that connection with the natural world is critical to this whole process. So I'm glad you brought that up. Here's a disturbing statistic for you. The average child in the United States today, they spend more time outdoors in structured play. I mean, they're playing soccer or whatever the case may be, but actually going out and kind of just exploring, hanging out in nature, learning how to play, use things in the natural world is, to construct their own, realities in a sandbox, whatever. That kind of unstructured play in nature has diminished dramatically over these generations. I mean, when we were growing up, most of us spend most of our time outdoors. Today, kids spend very little time outdoors, and when they do spend it outdoors, it's usually in some kind of structured or organized activity. And that can lead them away from that connection and immersion in the natural world. So parents in particular and grandparents and so on really need to find those opportunities to grow that love of nature, which for most kids is there. It's inherent. It just needs to be awakened in those who don't already have it.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Jan. Thanks, Philip. Hey, Greg.
Well, a few things actually intrigued me while you were talking, but one was that you had mentioned that the kids have concerns about their own impact on the climate, and I suppose that it extends to the weather. What is that true across most of those age groups, even the under fives? And how does that manifest itself with those kids?
I don't think it's very evident in the younger children. It's something you have to kind of bring to their attention most of the time, though that's changing because the amount of media exposure in young kids today is really skyrocketing. So they are getting exposed to some, news reports or other media that kind of raise their angst about all of this. So fundamentally, I think, what kids really do, when kids really do express this angst, they do it at two different levels. One of them isn't conscious and intentional, and this is in the older kids, particularly the teens, where they're aware of what's going on, and they're also aware of their own emotional reaction to it, so they can talk about it. Yeah, I saw, all the floods and the wildfires, and wow, this is really looking like Armageddon out there, and they can talk about it, and they're aware of how they're feeling about it. There are other young people who are having feelings about it, but they're not consciously aware of the connection between the feelings they're having and what they're actually viewing or experiencing out in the world. So it's, as we say, subconscious. And it's not unusual to have a young person, or an adult for that matter, say, I've got this underlying sense of being ill at ease, of something's not right, something's wrong in the world, but I can't quite put my finger on it. It's just always right there in the background. It seems like everything's chaotic and out of control and heading toward a bad place, but they don't make the connection right away between the feeling they're having, which is pervasive, and a particular trigger for that feeling. And this, ask it, what makes you feel that way? And then they'll start talking about, well, I saw this thing the other day and this was on the news and I heard my friends talking about, and you can help them make that connection so they can have a more conscious and self-aware conversation about it.
Do they relate that to their own actions? I mean, myself and quite a few people that I know think about the day-to-day things that we do, whether it's driving someplace unnecessarily, or should we take a long flight to Europe, or whatever it happens to be. Our young kids, and that's kind of what I took from your comments, was that even young children are already becoming aware that their own actions may be contributing to the to climate change.
They become most aware of that when through their parents or their grandparents or other members of their family, older members of their family. If those individuals are talking about those impacts and they are modifying their behavior around those impacts, meaning, no, I'm not going to fly to Europe because of the impact on the environment, and they talk openly around their children about that, the children can be curious. I mean, children have tremendous curiosity, particularly about what makes their older family members tick and why they do what they do and how they feel about things. So the parents and the grandparents and the other family members really become the primary conduit for them to wake up to how their behavior and the behavior of their family and their community and eventually their nation affects the climate crisis. Most of them don't just come by that on their own. They really have to, in a sense, be educated about it. And sometimes the best education is the role modeling.
Thank you. Chris Meyer.
Sure.
Hi.
Hi.
I really, really, really appreciate you talking to us. This is something that has bothered me. I've got some grandchildren, and I want to talk specifically about my two preteen granddaughters. So I don't live with them, and like they've got this happy little life and the ballet and la la la. I can go and ask them, have you thought about climate change? But if they say no, then do I just let it go by and wait for 6 months and see if their answer changes? I know that the nature things that you're talking about, they've done that with their schools and so that sort of stuff, but I don't know. I don't think they talk about it at their house. I don't think it gets brought up with the family, with the folks. So anyhow, that's my question to you. If they say no, do I say, well, let me tell you, the world's coming to an end, and where have you been?
Yeah, that's kind of what the temptation is, isn't it? But I would discourage you from taking that approach unless something about them which suggests otherwise. The approach I would take is, if you ask them about it, if you thought, if you thought much about climate change, and they go, no, as opposed to saying, well, I have, and let me tell you about, it's better to say something along the lines of, hey, I've spent a lot of time, looking at this, talking to other people about it, being involved in it. If you ever want to talk about it, let me know. I'd be happy to discuss it with you. So you basically hand them a ticket. You say, here's a ticket if you want to come talk about it. But you don't try to compel them to do it, because particularly if they're what do they call them, tweens, or what, I don't know what the term is, or teenagers, they're kind of in the process of becoming their own people, or they're doing what Jung called individuation. So a lot of times, if you come to them and want to talk to them about something, they feel like maybe you're trying to impose your view on them, or tell them what to do or whatever. And sometimes that's where the no comes from. They don't want to open themselves up to being talked at about something. So telling them that you're willing to talk with them, should they ever want to, you're not going to force it, it's not an expectation, but you're happy to do it. That's probably the easiest way to up the chances that that conversation will eventually take place. It's
Thank
also,
you.
and I've seen some grandparents do this too, where they will, and again, kids love video, right? So they will find an age appropriate video that addresses the issue, and they'll send it to them and just say, oh, I ran across this interesting video you might want to watch. After you're done, if you'd like to talk about it, I'd be happy to. No pressure, but if you want to, just let me know. That's another way to try to open the door to that dialogue.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Philip. Hey, Charlie.
Okay, gee, great work, Philip. I'm really impressed with what you're doing and how you've sorted this all out. My question is, have you ever encountered young people who say, yeah, I've studied this, we're doomed, I'm just going to ignore it and have a good time as long as I can?
You bet. And the important thing to know about that is when we run into that kind of attitude, we might as well live for today because tomorrow is going to be a nightmare, that kind of thing. When you run into that sort of attitude, it's important to remind ourselves what's behind that. What's behind that isn't just, cynicism and, that sort of thing. What's really behind it is fear.
Sure.
That these young people who have that attitude are deeply concerned and afraid about what's going on, and they're using denial as a way to keep that fear at bay. They're pushing it away and saying, oh, it doesn't really matter what we do. There's nothing we can do to stop it. We're all doomed. So eat, drink, and be merry, that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
That comes from fear. And so what I try to do when I run into that is I don't challenge it. I don't say, well, there is hope, or you should care, or, that sort of thing. If they're open to it, I just go deeper with that. Tell me more about that. Tell me how you came to that conclusion, and, what experiences have you had that brought you to that mindset? And what do you think is going to be the consequence of if a lot of people go into that frame of mind? You ask them questions. And that shows, again, that you respect them, that you're interested in their opinions, and they're more likely then to open up a little bit about that fear that's behind the denial and behind the, oh, what, me worry, that kind of thing. And once you can dig in a little deeper with that, sometimes you can crack the armor and get inside their head. But yeah, there's definitely young people who feel that way. And some of them, let's peel the onion. So at the outside, you'll have this, doomsday kind of, cynicism, denial. Right behind that, you'll often find anger. And then behind that, you'll find fear. 90% of the time when you see anger, you look behind the curtain, pull back Oz's curtain, and you'll see that there's fear. That's what drives the anger.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
One of the things that we do or one of the things that we try to do anyway, is to encourage the dissemination of information about climate through the media as well as other channels. I mean, thinking about things like on weather reports and stuff, and there's some of that starting to happen where some weather reports anyways, they're mentioning that this could be the effect of climate change and so forth. And maybe I'm a little naive in thinking that kids in that age group even listen to the weather on TV or whatever. But there are obviously other channels which we also are looking to push that message. Is that to some extent counterproductive for kids in those age groups because of where they're getting the information and the context that they're getting that information in?
I don't know if it's counterproductive, but it's definitely can miss the audience in the sense that we know a significant majority of young people do not watch, like your local TV news where they have the weather, or they certainly don't turn on the weather channel, which, by the way, mentions climate change a lot. They're more likely to absorb, and their surveys showing this is true, a tremendous amount of the information they absorb comes to them through social media channels, including peer-based information that is highly suspect in many cases. So it's one of the challenges we face around young people is getting good, accurate information, including hopeful information to them. And that's not an easy thing to do. The school systems that have adopted approaches around this where they're doing environmental education and talking about these challenges with kids and how they can affect them are often a more powerful conduit for that than mainstream, network TV kind of stuff. Because young people just don't, unlike some of us, I mean, when we were growing up and TV was kind of this new cool thing, we were all over it. A lot of young people today don't watch very much TV at all. What they watch is either on streaming services or social media or YouTube or, places like that. And so when we want to reach that population, we have to look at what media channels they use and go after those channels as best we can.
Thank you, Philip. Hey, Tom.
Yeah, Mr. Chard. I don't know if the other one you didn't mention or probably weren't aware. About a month or 6 weeks ago, PBS did a 3-part series on Greta Thunberg, and started out at 16, and just by herself, and what an incredible young lady. And she, the series, the 3-part series was just amazing. She went to the coal miners who were losing their job and had sympathy for them for their losing their job. I mean, so I guess that would be the next step, I think, is to think about how we can get that kind of information, that kind of a spokesperson for what we're concerned about. Obviously, she's not going to come here again. She had to sail across it. You wouldn't fly across it, the ocean. She had to sail across. But the point is maybe we need to think about how we get some young people like that who are willing to start the conversation.
Yeah, and there actually are. That's a great example. You're right. That's a wonderful series. And, she's a tremendous role model for young people in this regard, and a very powerful role model, which is probably why the climate change deniers are scared out of their wits about her, and they call her names and accuse her of being all kinds of things, because she scares them. Okay, because she's such a truth teller, and she's so good at it. What I have seen on a number of university campuses in particular, in some university settings and even in some high school settings, there are groups of students who they come together, organize their own initiatives, and take those on in a way that's a microcosm of what what Greta's doing. And so there are people who are kind of picking up on her as a role model and emulating some of what she's doing. And that's a really encouraging sign. But young people, they're often going to listen to each other more than they're going to listen to us. Okay. So when you have one of their own talking to them about this stuff, they're often much more receptive when it's somebody like me, for example. And so, yeah, the more we can put in front of them role models who are part of their age group, the greater the opportunity that we're going to influence their thinking.
Thank you, Philip. I'd like to jump in here right now. I don't see anybody on the stack. And this information was absolutely wonderful. I was driving to Appleton last week to see my son and grandson, and a lot of what we talk about kind of reflects there. And I've always been of the opinion that I'd rather train a puppy than an old dog. And kind of we're talking about the puppies here versus the old dog. And then I see my grandson who goes to a school where they have to be outside in a learning situation half the class time, winter, rain, anything. And then I have a son who doesn't reflect how I reflect on things. And he's kind of more of a closed-minded, okay? And so what I'm talking about, these lessons that we're talking about here, I'll tell you, through the peace movement and the last Iraq war, and I was leader nationally and internationally, one of the biggest difficulties many people, adults in our movement had, was going home for Thanksgiving or Christmas and talking to their brother, sister, or their mother or father. And certainly there are implications here. But with adults, there's that situation where they don't have to listen. They don't have to sit down. They can turn their back. And with the political divide that we have in our country, in terms of what's right or wrong and what science is and being against science, you know, these are our difficulties in this movement. And until we begin, and so in that ride, I was listening to public radio and they were talking about this book where the author was emphasizing that we have to talk to each other. We don't talk to each other about climate as adults. We don't talk to our family. We don't talk to our coworkers, and the fear and rejection in that process. But at the same time, as a movement, until we as activists move more people to affect the politicians, we're not going to keep rolling, you know, we're not going to grow. So my issue and my question is, as we talk about this, how do we apply it to adults? Thank you.
One of the different topics I've spoken on during the really the lead up to the last presidential election and then the aftermath of it as well. The lead request I had on topics was that how do people talk across the political divide? And there is, interestingly enough, through the University of California, Berkeley, what's called the Greater Good Science Center has put together a whole methodology around how you have those conversations in a way that helps people to keep their shields down, which is not easy these days. And yet they have a formula that does work more often than not. So you might want to check that out. The organization, again, is called the Greater Good Science Center, and it's at the University of California, Berkeley, Greater Good Science Center. And they have a program on their website about how to talk across the political divide. And there are ways that we can do that increase the odds that we'll actually have a conversation as opposed to a shouting match or, you know, something of that sort. And again, nothing's foolproof. There are some people you simply cannot reach, period. You know, it's the second you bring up the topic, you know, the doors slam shut and it's over. But with most people, there is a way to open up that dialogue. And as you might expect, it's not unlike some of the points I made about having conversations with young people. You ask questions. It's about a lot of questioning, the kinds of questions you ask before you get into sharing your opinion. There's also an interesting body of evidence about the fact that one of the things that drives this divide around the environment is differences in values, core values. We've known for a long time through personality testing that there are differences in core values between so-called liberals and conservatives. I know there's lots of variations. I'll just dump us all into one of those buckets, okay? And what they found is that because there are these value differences between these two kind of political sides, if you will, they talk at the other side from their value perspective, which goes right past the people who have a different set of values. I'll give you an example from the environmental movement. It's called moral reframing. That's the process I'm talking about here. What you do is use the other person's value system to frame your opinions and your arguments, so it's more likely that they'll listen to them or even respond positively to them. There was a study done showing that when so-called liberals spend a lot of time hammering away at the environmental issue by pointing out all the damage that's being done to the earth, you know, the water, the land, the air, the animals, everything, all these terrible things that are happening, when they really emphasize that, it goes right past somebody who's more conservative. However, if you take that same argument and you put it in a frame that says, you know, the reason we need to protect the environment, you don't go to the reason we need to protect the environment is to avoid all this damage. You go to the reason we need to protect the environment is to keep it pure and productive and to support the economy. And then right away, they're going to be going, oh, that's interesting, because that aligns with their values. Okay, their value, you know, moral values are purity, tradition, economic growth. I mean, all this kind of stuff. If you talk to them in their value frame, they're going to probably hear you. If you talk to them from your value frame, not so much. So yes, there are ways to do it. It ain't easy, but there's a methodology out there, and I'd encourage you to look it up.
Will do. Thank you, Philip. Hey, Tom Siri.
So Philip said we got to, look at ways we can take action. And I guess most of us on here are a little bit older. And yet, I don't know, not everybody's pictured there. But it seems to me what we need as 350 need to figure out is how we get some of the young people we know and be committing ourselves to put some money together so that those young people can then go out and start doing something with their age group. Every Friday, it's, the group who's out there is at least retired. And so all I want to suggest is that we perhaps get into a conversation about how do we identify a young person who's going to be who we can support them, financially, or however we can do that, so that they can go out and go into the schools and go around the schools and talk to kids. So that's, for me, that's taking action. And that gives me hope. If we got some kid out there, young person, whatever, who's going out and talking to other young people and getting them organized and doing something about it, that gives me hope. So that's my latest weird idea.
It's not a weird idea. When you look at organizations like particularly large corporations is an example, when they're trying to affect some kind of a culture change, they're trying to create a new corporate culture, as they say. One of the things they'll often do is they will solicit volunteers from inside the organization, and they'll put them through a training program and then designate them as champions, meaning these are people who are trained in this, they have some expertise in it, they know how to have dialogue with others about it. And then they announce those people and say, if you have questions about this new initiative, here's one of our champions, go talk to them, they'll support you in your efforts to bring this along. I don't know that it works all that well in a corporate environment, but I think in a community environment, when you have people, and in a school, if you did this, where you designate somebody as this is a champion for this cause, they know about it, they can help you get involved, they can support you in getting involved, that could help accomplish what you're talking about.
Thank you. Thanks, Tom. Tom, that brings up a thought that I had earlier in terms of the kinds of things that we have done. And I think one of the things that we were very proud of was raising money and bringing young people from the NAACP and from the Wisconsin Association of Native Americans to New York City for the huge climate march of 400,000, and an international conference, which they all attended. After that point, it was kind of all lost. We keep plowing away, and we lost touch with that. And then the next big march in DC, we again brought kids from the NAACP and the Wisconsin Native American Council and raised the funds. And it was a great experience, but we never had the foresight or the ability to keep in touch, at least to bring back and continue some kind of relationship. And I was thinking about some of the things that we've done with young people. And it's been by event, but not by program. Hey, Tom.
Yeah. So I mean, the obvious idea is 350 hire somebody, but I don't know that 350 is ready to do that. But maybe we do that through peace action. maybe we get some money into peace action for an environmental activist. I'm just causing trouble. You know that I just causing trouble, but I think, we got to do something to get more of those people that George, as you're talking about, to get them, coming back around again, not necessarily to us, but whoever is going to do this. So, and like I say, I'm certainly willing to put up some money and, I'm not rich, but if everybody puts up some money, maybe we got enough to hire somebody through Peace Action. Because I'm co-chair, you guys are, involved in that. We can probably get them and that Peace Action to hire somebody, and I don't know how much we got to figure out how to do that, but that would be a way of getting somebody who's full-time devoted to it.
Yes.
And I think that's the next step I want to push.
Okay, I hear you. Time check. The time check says that we're over time right now. So I think this should be taken up by the steering committee in terms of a conversation around it and evolve what we can do within our capabilities. Is that okay, steering committee? Can we get a hand raised on that one?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. Thank you so much. Hey, Philip, thank you very much. We really
My pleasure.
thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. Yes.
Thank you. And again, I want to thank you folks for what you do on behalf of the environmental movement. Thank you very much.
So be sure to join us again next month, same time, same place. It'll be another Zoom call, the second Tuesday of the month. And we're going to be talking about the issue of how plastics is really a fossil fuel issue. Plastic doesn't grow on trees. It's the title of the presentation, and it comes from oil. And there's a huge plans for the plastic industry to build enormous new plastic production plants in this country, and probably worldwide. But I know I've heard of 5 huge projects in this country that are planned, and we have a terrible problem with the use of the oil. Number one, the emissions from these processes. Number two, and the crap that's left over in the form of all this plastic waste. So it's going to be a really interesting program, and hopefully we can brainstorm on what we can do and some of this with that issue. So thank you everyone for joining us, and be sure to check out Michael Mann when he's speaking. Watch for our emails. Greg Walter does a wonderful job on putting out our email newsletter. Be sure to
Julie, let me add to your comment about fossil fuels, because there's a whole huge industry called petrochemicals, of everything from some kinds of pharmaceuticals down to the stuff you're talking about. And the petrochemicals are very polluting, many of them are, and it's one aspect of fossil fuels that we don't normally discuss.
Good point. Okay, thank you everyone. I think we need to say goodnight.
Good night, all.
Good night, all.
Good night.
Night.